Number 8. The Great Oxidation Event. The first great prehistoric nightmare did not come from teeth, claws, or an asteroid. It came from oxygen. That is the hook, because it flips the viewer's instincts immediately. The same gas keeping you alive right now may once have poisoned much of life already living on Earth. Around 2.4 billion years ago, during what scientists call the Great Oxidation Event, Earth's atmosphere began changing in a way that was catastrophic for huge parts of the biosphere. Before that shift, most organisms lived in a world with little free oxygen. Then, photosynthetic microbes, especially cyanobacteria, kept pumping more of it into the oceans and atmosphere. At first, the oxygen was absorbed by dissolved iron and other chemical sinks. But once those sinks filled, the chemistry of the planet began to turn. For anaerobic organisms built for the old Earth, this was not progress. It was poison spreading across the world. That is why this case has to open the countdown. The mainstream explanation is not mysterious. Life altered the chemistry of the planet, and the altered planet began selecting against the life that had thrived before. Oxygen is highly reactive. For organisms not adapted to it, rising oxygen meant cellular damage, shrinking safe habitats, and a world becoming less survivable by the million years. That explanation is strong. But the deeper reason the event feels like a nightmare is that the disaster may have come from life itself. No giant predator, no impact crater, no obvious explosion in the sky, just the slow accumulation of a gas that would eventually make complex life possible while first helping destroy a world that already existed. That is a brutal pattern, and it will return throughout this video. Prehistoric disaster does not only arrive from outside. Sometimes the world changes because biology rewrites the environment too hard and too fast for older life to keep up. It also matters because this was not just a die-off. It was a planetary transition harsh enough to divide Earth's history into before and after. Oceans changed. The atmosphere changed. The energy logic of life changed. The sky itself changed. In other words, the first nightmare on this list may also have been the opening move toward the kind of world that could later produce animals, ecosystems, and eventually humans. That contrast is what gives the Great Oxidation Event its force. It is both catastrophe and precondition. It is life making the planet deadlier before making it more complex. It turned the biosphere into a place where survival increasingly depended on tolerating a chemistry that had once been hostile. And once the countdown starts there, the next case has to turn away from chemistry and into something far more immediate. Because now, the nightmare is not a poisoned atmosphere. It is a pit in the ground filled with human bodies. Number 7. Talheim Death Pit. A pit in prehistoric Germany held the bodies of men, women, and children thrown in together after blows to the head and arrow wounds ended their lives. That is where the countdown changes shape. Not from planetary nightmare to mystery, but from planetary nightmare to crime scene. Talheim, in southern Germany, dates to around 5000 BC and belongs to the linear pottery culture, one of the earliest farming societies in Central Europe. When archaeologists excavated the grave, they found the remains of at least 34 people. Many showed lethal blunt force trauma to the skull. Some had arrow injuries. The demographic spread mattered immediately. This was not a burial of fallen warriors only. It included women. It included children. It included a whole slice of a community. That is why Talheim still hits so hard. It does not look like battle cleanup. It looks like a massacre. The mainstream interpretation is exactly that. A farming settlement or group was attacked, multiple people were killed, and the bodies were dumped rapidly into a mass grave outside the pattern of normal burial. That explanation is strong because the physical evidence supports it. The injuries are concentrated, violent, and indiscriminate. The deeper reason Talheim belongs this high in the video is that it destroys a comforting story people still carry about the Neolithic. Agriculture is often imagined as the beginning of stability, villages, storage, and social order. Talheim forces the darker version into view. Settled life also creates boundaries, property, resentment, and targets. Once people begin investing labor into one place, the consequences of losing that place become much more severe. A raid can become extermination. A conflict can leave behind not only dead individuals, but a whole community reduced to a pit. That is why Talheim feels less like archaeology and more like forensic recovery across 5,000 years. The grave does not just preserve bones, it preserves choices. Who was struck? Who was not spared? How quickly the bodies were disposed of? And once the viewer understands that early farming Europe could already produce violence on this scale, the larger thesis of the video starts to lock into place. Prehistoric nightmares were not only environmental, they were human. The same species that learned to plant fields and build villages also learned how to turn those villages into kill sites. The Talheim grave is terrifying because it shows murder becoming social in scale. And once one pit proves that families could be bludgeoned, shot, and thrown into the ground together, the next stretch of the countdown has to ask an even worse question. What if some prehistoric killers were not only murdering whole groups, but doing it with signs of method? Number 6. Snowball Earth. Imagine a planet so cold that the oceans themselves begin to disappear under ice. Not sea ice at the poles, not glaciers creeping across high mountains. A world where frozen surfaces may have spread so far toward the equator that Earth, from space, could have looked less like a living planet than a pale, sealed object drifting in darkness. That is the power of Snowball Earth. During parts of the Cryogenian period, especially around the Sturgeon and Marinoan glaciations, the planet may have entered intervals so severe that ice covered enormous portions of the surface, possibly coming close to global reach. Even the softer versions of the hypothesis are bad enough to earn a place here. This was not just colder weather. It was a collapse in habitability on a planetary scale. That is why Snowball Earth works so well this high in the countdown. The mainstream explanation centers on feedback loops. As ice expanded, Earth reflected more solar radiation back into space. More reflection meant more cooling. More cooling meant more ice. Once that mechanism gained enough force, the climate system could drive itself toward a state of extreme global glaciation. That explanation is strong because it shows how a world can trap itself. No impact was required, no invading force, no monstrous predator, just the climate machinery slipping into a feedback loop brutal enough to squeeze life toward the margins. The deeper point is what that means for survival. Photosynthesis would have come under enormous pressure. Marine ecosystems would have narrowed. Habitable refuges may have been reduced to limited zones of open water, thin ice, volcanic margins, or chemical niches where life could still function at all. In plain terms, much of Earth may have become a hostile shell around the few places where the biosphere still had room to breathe. What makes Snowball Earth feel like a nightmare rather than simply a geological episode is the contrast between scale and silence. A mass extinction with giant carcasses and erupting mountains is easy to picture. A nearly frozen planet is worse in another way. It gives you emptiness. It gives you the image of life hanging on under pressure so total that the sky, the sea, and the horizon all stop looking like places built for survival. That is the real force of the case. The Great Oxidation Event showed the biosphere becoming chemically hostile. Snowball Earth shows it becoming physically hostile on a near-global scale. The first nightmare poisoned the world. This one locked it down. It also matters because, like the oxygen catastrophe before it, Snowball Earth may have helped set the stage for later biological innovation. The world that emerged from these glaciations was not the same world that entered them. Environmental stress, chemical shifts, and the long aftermath of extreme cold may have shaped the conditions under which more complex life later expanded. That pattern is becoming hard to ignore. Prehistoric disaster repeatedly acts like a filter. It crushes what cannot adapt, then forces the survivors into a different Earth. That is why this case belongs here. It is not just a frozen curiosity. It is a reminder that the planet has more than one way to become unlivable. And once the countdown moves from a nearly sealed Earth back down into human prehistory, the next nightmare becomes more intimate and more cruel, because now the evidence is not trapped in ice. It is buried in a pit, and the bodies suggest the killers may have taken their time. Number 5. Schöneck-Kilianstädten. Schöneck-Kilianstädten is where prehistoric violence starts to feel less like massacre alone and more like procedure. In an early Neolithic mass grave in Germany, archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 26 people, including adults and children, all deposited together after extreme lethal violence. The basic facts are already bad enough. Many of the victims had severe blunt force injuries to the skull. Arrow trauma was present too. But what makes this site so hard to shake is the pattern lower in the body. Multiple victims showed broken tibiae, and the repetition was so strong that the excavators argued this was not random breakage caused by burial pressure, later disturbance, or collapse. It looked deliberate. It looked as if people had been disabled, tortured, or mutilated in a repeated way before or during the killings. That is what pushes the site into nightmare territory. Talheim proved that entire groups could be bludgeoned and dumped. Schöneck-Kilianstädten suggests that whoever did the killing may have had a method. The mainstream interpretation is massacre, and in this case, the evidence for collective lethal violence is unusually strong. The injuries are concentrated. The age spread matters. This was not a grave of selected combatants. It was a grave of a community broken apart. The deeper reason the site belongs this high in the countdown is that the damage does not feel accidental in its patterning. Repeated leg fractures across different victims imply control. They imply that the attackers were not simply striking whoever they could reach in the chaos of a fight. They may have been overpowering people systematically, injuring them in ways that prevented escape, resistance, or movement, then finishing the attack. That possibility changes the emotional logic of the site. It stops looking like one burst of rage and starts looking like managed brutality. That is what makes Schöneck-Kilianstädten such an effective second case in this part of the video. The Great Oxidation Event was nightmare by chemistry. Snowball Earth was nightmare by climate. Talheim was nightmare by massacre. Schöneck-Kilianstädten goes one step darker. It hints that prehistoric killing could already carry signs of sequencing, control, and cruelty directed through the body in repeated ways. It is one thing to find a pit full of the dead. It is worse to find evidence suggesting the dead may have been handled according to a pattern before they were thrown into it. And once that pattern enters the countdown, the mood changes permanently. The viewer is no longer just watching worlds fail or communities get overrun. The viewer is watching the archaeological record preserve clues that look disturbingly close to intent. That is the bridge into the next section of the video, because after environmental nightmares and community massacres comes a different kind of horror altogether. A world where the sea itself begins to choke, and survival stops depending on what can fight hardest and starts depending on what can endure a biosphere falling apart around it. Number 4. The Late Devonian Collapse. If Talheim and Schöneck-Kilianstädten showed what human beings could do to each other, The late Devonian collapse shows what happens when the planet itself starts suffocating the living world. This is one of the most unsettling disaster patterns in the whole video, because it does not look like one clean strike. It looks like a system slowly losing the conditions that made life possible in the first place. By the Devonian, the seas were already crowded with fish, reef systems, and complex marine food webs. This was not an early experimental world still figuring itself out. Then that world began to fail. Reef communities were devastated. Major marine groups declined. Vast areas of the ocean appear to have suffered from low oxygen, and the effect was less like a single blow than a long tightening grip. That is why the late Devonian belongs exactly here in the countdown. The mainstream explanation is that this was not one isolated extinction pulse, but a sequence of crises, probably driven by changing climate, shifting nutrient cycles, and widespread marine anoxia. That explanation is strong because it fits the evidence. Oceans do not need to boil, freeze, or explode to become lethal. They only need to stop circulating in the ways life depends on. Once oxygen levels fall and ecological balance starts to slip, entire marine systems can become harder and harder to sustain. The deeper point is what that does to the imagination. A meteor impact is terrifying because it is immediate. The late Devonian is terrifying because it is slow. It shows a world that still looks alive from the outside, while the basic ability of its oceans to support life begins to unravel from within. That is what makes it a prehistoric nightmare rather than just a technical extinction event. Coral systems and reef builders should signal abundance. In the Devonian, they became signs that the biosphere was losing stability. Food webs began collapsing, not because one predator dominated too well, but because the environment itself became harder to inhabit. The Great Oxidation Event poisoned one world. Snowball Earth nearly froze another. The late Devonian collapse now shows a different kind of horror entirely, a sea that begins to lose its breath. And once the countdown reaches that point, the next case has to be the one where the planet pushes this logic to its most brutal extreme, because now the question is no longer how a biosphere struggles. It is how close the Earth came to breaking complex life almost completely. Number 3, the Permian-Triassic Extinction. The end Permian extinction is where prehistoric nightmare stops sounding exaggerated and starts sounding inadequate. Around 252 million years ago, Earth passed through the most severe extinction event known in the fossil record. This was not one bad century. It was the closest the planet seems to have come to almost ending complex life outright. Marine species were devastated on a colossal scale. Land ecosystems were shattered. Entire evolutionary lineages that had dominated the Permian world simply failed to cross the boundary. That is why this case has to stand near the very top. Once the viewer reaches the Permian-Triassic extinction, the countdown is no longer just about violent episodes in the deep past. It is about the moment Earth itself came closest to becoming unrecognizable for the life then living on it. The mainstream explanation centers on the Siberian traps, a vast episode of flood volcanism in what is now Russia. Those eruptions released enormous volumes of greenhouse gases and other compounds over a geologically brief interval, driving rapid warming, acid rain, ocean acidification, and severe oxygen loss in the seas. That chain matters because it shows how prehistoric disaster becomes truly monstrous. One stressor would already be bad enough. The end Permian delivered many at once. Rising heat hammered life on land. Warmer oceans held less oxygen. Marine chemistry shifted in ways hostile to shell-building organisms and food webs already under strain. Ecological systems did not just get damaged. they began failing across multiple fronts at the same time. That is the difference between an extinction and a nightmare. The first tells you many species died. The second shows you a world where survival itself starts running out of usable pathways. The deeper reason this case feels so brutal is that it makes the Earth look comprehensive in its violence. The Great Oxidation Event changed chemistry. Snowball Earth changed climate. The late Devonian collapse strangled the oceans. The end Permian seems to combine multiple nightmares into one planetary pressure system. Heat, toxicity, acidification, oxygen loss, and food web collapse all begin stacking together until the biosphere is forced through an almost impossibly narrow bottleneck. That is why the event is still called the Great Dying. It is not sensational language. It is one of the clearest admissions science can make that life on Earth's has been through moments of nearly unthinkable brutality. And yet this case matters for one more reason. The world after the nightmare was not the same world as before it. Extinction did not simply erase. It reselected. Survivors inherited a radically altered Earth. New ecological hierarchies had to form in the long shadow of a biosphere that had nearly stopped working. That is what makes the end Permian such a powerful number 3. It is not just the worst dying. It is the moment the viewer fully understands that prehistoric nightmare was never only about fear. It was about replacement. Entire worlds were broken so completely that whatever came after had to learn how to live on a different planet. Number 2. Charterhouse Warren. Charterhouse Warren is where the countdown stops feeling like massacre alone and starts feeling like desecration. In a shaft in Somerset, England, archaeologists recovered the remains of at least 37 people, dating to the early Bronze Age. The body count is already severe. What turns the site into a prehistoric nightmare is what happened after death. The human remains were heavily fragmented, mixed together, and marked by treatment that went beyond simple disposal. Recent analysis argued that the assemblage preserves evidence not only of lethal violence, but of dismemberment and possible cannibalism. That matters because it changes the emotional category of the crime. Talheim showed a community killed and dumped. Schöneck-Kilianstädten suggested method and cruelty. Charterhouse Warren goes further. It suggests that even after the killing ended, the dead were still being acted on. The mainstream interpretation is careful but grim. The stronger reading is that the shaft received human remains after extreme interpersonal violence and post-mortem treatment severe enough to imply the collapse of every ordinary boundary between killing, disposal, and symbolic domination. That explanation is already dark. But the deeper reason the site belongs at number 2 is that it reveals a level of brutality most viewers do not expect from early Bronze Age Britain. Fragmentation, butchery marks, and the possibility of anthropophagy force the viewer to confront something worse than massacre. They force the viewer to confront a world in which the dead could be reduced further, broken down after death, in ways that erase dignity as completely as life. This is why Charterhouse Warren is such an effective penultimate case. It does not just show a prehistoric crime scene, it shows the aftermath of one in which the bodies themselves may have become part of the final message. That is also why the site changes the rhythm of the video so hard. The Great Oxidation Event, Snowball Earth, the late Devonian collapse, and the Permian-Triassic Extinction were nightmares at planetary scale. Talheim and Schöneck-Kilianstädten were nightmares of human violence. Charterhouse Warren combines something from both categories. It feels environmental in its bleakness and human in its cruelty. It is a shaft full of remains that looks less like a burial and more like the last stage of a process no one involved was meant to survive with dignity intact. And once the countdown reaches that point, the only possible final case is not one more grave, one more extinction, or one more climate swing. The final case has to be a whole world where nightmare was not concentrated in one pit or one eruption. It was built into the landscape itself. Number 1. The Quaternary predator world. The strongest final case is not one monster, it is a whole world full of them. By the Quaternary, especially across the Pleistocene, Earth was crowded with predator guilds powerful enough to make survival feel conditional at every level of the landscape. Cave lions, dire wolves, short-faced bears, giant hyenas, saber-toothed cats, large crocodilians in some regions, packs, ambush hunters, scavengers, and apex carnivores, all overlapping with herds of megafauna and, eventually, with humans. That matters because this final nightmare is broader than any single disaster. The planet did not need to freeze over, poison itself, or erupt to become terrifying. It only needed to become a place where enormous predators occupied the same world as increasingly intelligent prey, and where even early humans were not yet secure at the top of the chain. That is the real force of the Quaternary predator world. It feels close. The air, the grasslands, the river margins, and the cold all look almost familiar. The safety does not. The mainstream explanation is straightforward. Ice Age ecosystems supported large herbivores at scale, and large herbivores support large predators. That explanation is correct. But the deeper point is why this belongs at number 1. Earlier cases in the countdown gave the viewer planetary horror, mass death, environmental collapse, and human cruelty. The Quaternary predator world unites them emotionally by taking nightmare out of the one-time event and turning it into daily existence. Imagine moving through a landscape where the top carnivores are not rare exceptions, but regular features of the environment, where a carcass can attract multiple killers, where dusk changes risk, where caves are not romantic shelters, but contested ground, and where the human body is still just one more animal body trying not to be selected. This is not the worst extinction in history. It is, in some ways, the most intimate, prehistoric nightmare of all. That intimacy is what makes the final payoff work. The Great Oxidation Event poisoned one world so another could begin. Snowball Earth nearly sealed the planet in ice. Talheim and Schöneck-Kilianstädten proved that human communities could become crime scenes. The late Devonian collapse showed oceans losing the ability to support life cleanly. The Permian revealed how many ways a planet can become lethal at once. Charterhouse Warren exposed what human brutality could do even after death. The Quaternary predator world now ties everything together by showing a prehistoric Earth where danger did not have to arrive as a single catastrophe. It could simply be the ordinary structure of life. That is the pattern this whole video has been building toward. Prehistoric nightmares were not only moments. Sometimes they were ecosystems. Sometimes they were the baseline. And that may be the hardest point in the entire countdown. People often imagine prehistory as dangerous in a vague, cinematic way. What the evidence actually suggests is worse. Different ages of the Earth built different kinds of nightmare. Some poisoned the air. Some froze the sea. Some suffocated oceans. Some erased communities in pits. Some left shafts full of butchered human remains. And some created worlds where the most important survival skill was waking up one more day in a landscape that was never designed to feel safe.